Have you ever made a decision with your head, only to have your heart rewrite everything? Charlotte Miller was a woman of quiet strength, content to live in the shadows of her own healing, until a contract brought her face to face with a billionaire who only wanted an heir. No love, no promises, just an agreement. But life doesn't follow contracts. And the moment she learned she was carrying not one, but two children, everything shifted. What would you do if the man who saw you as a transaction began to see you? Would you walk away to protect yourself or stay, risking everything, even your heart, for something that feels like a miracle? This isn't just a love story. It's a story of two broken people choosing to stay when it was easier to run, of becoming parents before becoming a couple, and of how sometimes the family we never planned for becomes the one we were always meant to have. So if you've ever loved quietly, feared deeply, or stayed longer than reason said you should, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. By the time Charlotte Miller stepped out of the glass tower that housed the Chicago headquarters of Lindmark Ventures, fat flakes had already begun to blanket the sidewalks. The city, normally buzzing even in winter, now felt subdued, muffled under a thickening veil of white. She pulled the collar of her camel wool coat tighter around her neck, shivering as a gust of wind crept under her scarf. Her breath fogged in the air as she looked down the avenue, squinting through the storm for a cab that wasn't coming. Her pitch had run late again, and not in the we want to know more kind of way. More like the polite nods and corporate smiles that said, "Don't call us, we'll call you." She'd spent 2 months preparing that presentation. 2 months of cutting expenses at her design studio back in Seattle, laying off her last full-time designer, skipping rent on her own apartment to pay her staff. All of it hinged on this client, this meeting, and now nothing but the slow crunch of snow under boots and the feeling that everything she'd built was slipping through her gloved fingers. The wind howled as she turned into the lobby of the Arcadia, a hotel she couldn't afford on her best day. But it was warm inside. Quiet, polished floors, golden lights, the scent of cedar and leather. She lingered near the fireplace in the entryway, her suitcase dripping slush beside her. A man behind the front desk looked up. "May I help you?" Miss Charlotte hesitated. She hated what came next. "I'm just waiting out the storm before I find somewhere to stay. I heard the airport shut down." He nodded. "Everything within 20 miles is booked. The convention, plus weather." His voice softened. "I'm sorry. So this is how it ends," she thought. Not with a dramatic failure, but with a slow freezing slide into nothing. No clients, no money, nowhere to sleep in a city that didn't know her name. "I can call around, see if anyone had a cancellation," but before she could answer, another voice cut through the lobby. "Give her the suite adjoining mine." The voice was smooth, warm, but held an edge of command that made the hairs on Charlotte's neck rise. She turned. He stood across the lobby, tall in a dark overcoat that somehow repelled the snow like it feared to touch him. His face was striking strong lines, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of weathered amber glass. His presence filled the space without effort. She knew that face. James Whitaker, founder of Whitaker Solutions, tech mogul, private, brilliant, rumored to be ruthless. She blinked. "Excuse me." He stepped forward, unbothered by the attention. "I have an adjoining suite. It's empty." "You're welcome to it, if you'd rather not sleep in a freezing terminal tonight." "I didn't ask for charity," she said, squaring her shoulders. His mouth tilted in something not quite a smile. "And I didn't offer it. Just practicality." The man behind the counter looked from James to Charlotte, clearly unsure what to do. "I can pay," Charlotte began, but James held up a gloved hand. "It's late. You look exhausted. Take the room. Consider it a favor." From one overworked professional to another. His tone wasn't flirty. It wasn't condescending. Just calm, unshaken, as if he were offering a seat at a crowded table, not a $3,000 a night suite. Charlotte exhaled slowly. Her fingers were numb, her shoes soaked through. And if she were honest, completely honest, There was something in his eyes that didn't feel dangerous. Just watching. "All right," she said finally, "but only for tonight." James nodded once, then turned and walked toward the elevator without another word. The bellman took her bag, and before she could second-guess herself, she followed. In the elevator, James glanced sideways at her. "You know my name, I imagine." She nodded. "Charlotte Miller. I run a design studio in Seattle." His brow lifted, intrigued. "What brought you to Linmark Ventures today?" Charlotte stilled. "You know Linmark. I know most people investing in emerging design tech hybrids. Were you pitching?" Her stomach dropped. "Yes." A pause. Then he said gently, "They should have said yes." She turned to him, eyes narrowed. "You weren't at that meeting." "I didn't have to be," he said, then smiled. "You're sharp. You've got steel in your spine. I can see it." The elevator chimed, and the doors opened into the penthouse floor. The suite was understated but impossibly elegant gray wool furnishings, soft gold lighting, a roaring fire. James opened the door to the adjoining room and handed her the key. No strings, no expectations, just heat and quiet. "I hope that's enough." Charlotte took the card key, her hand brushing his glove. His fingers were warm, solid. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked a little. James's expression didn't change, but something softened in his eyes. "Good night, Ms. Miller." She closed the door behind her, and for the first time in months, she slept. The sun was still hiding behind thick clouds when Charlotte awoke. The room was quiet, the kind of silence money could buy. Heavy blackout curtains, a mattress softer than anything she'd ever slept on, the low hum of distant wind against the windows. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she sat up, slowly, and it came rushing back the snow, the failed pitch, the man in the tailored coat with amber eyes and a voice like firewood cracking. James Whitaker. Charlotte glanced at the time. 8:09 a.m. Her phone, still on low battery, blinked with no new emails, not even a rejection. She got up, washed her face, ran her fingers through her curls, and tried to make herself look less like a woman who had slept with her shame and disappointment curled around her like a blanket. She packed her small suitcase with practiced speed. When she stepped into the penthouse common area, James was already awake. He stood barefoot on the dark hardwood floor, a black turtleneck fitting close to his frame as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. The smell wrapped around her bold, warm, comforting. "You're an early riser," he said without turning. "Habit," Charlotte replied. "I run a business. Sort of." He offered her a mug. She hesitated for half a breath, then took it. "Thank you. Again. For last night." James leaned against the counter, his gaze settling on her without pretense. "I meant it when I said no expectations. I know." She sipped the coffee. Dark roast. Rich. Real cream. Probably from some farm upstate. "I looked you up last night," he said suddenly. Charlotte's spine stiffened. "That's not exactly comforting. I read your proposal to Linmark. One of my partners sent it to me months ago." She blinked. "You read my proposal?" He nodded. "You're better than most of the agencies they've greenlit." Charlotte didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever looked her in the eye and said it like it wasn't a favor. He walked toward the window. Snow still coated the skyline. He stood in front of it, backlit, arms crossed over his chest. "I have a proposition." Charlotte laughed, short and bitter. "Didn't I just go through one of those with Linmark? This one's different." He turned. She met his gaze, and something in it made her set the mug down. "All right," she said, slow. "I'm listening." James was quiet for a long beat. When he finally spoke, it was with a softness that made the words sharper. "I want a child." Charlotte's heart paused. "Excuse me, I have a genetic heart condition. Not fatal, but progressive. Long QT syndrome. I've managed it, but there's no guarantee for how long." She stared at him. "And you're telling me this because—" "I've built an empire," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "But I have no one to leave it to. No family nearby, no children. Relationships don't last long in my world. James, this is sounding like a documentary intro. He took a breath. I want to create a life, someone to carry that legacy, and I want that person to be intelligent, driven, emotionally stable, someone whose character I admire. Charlotte blinked again. You can't be serious. You're asking me to have your child. Yes, that's insane. James stepped closer, his voice calm, even gentle. I'm offering full medical support, $5 million in investment for your agency, co-parenting rights, no romantic obligations, just a plan. A plan. Charlotte took a step back. You're proposing a womb for equity exchange. That's not a plan. That's an absurd, wildly inappropriate idea. I don't see it that way. Of course you don't. You're a billionaire. To you, everything can be negotiated. No, he said, quiet. Not everything. But some things can be chosen. There was a long silence. Charlotte stared at him, her fingers trembling slightly around the ceramic mug. Finally, she asked, why me? He hesitated. Then, because last night, when you walked into that lobby, you looked like you were about to shatter. But you didn't. You kept your spine straight, your voice steady. You didn't ask for help. You just stood there, stubborn and proud and tired as hell, but still whole. I'm not whole, she said, barely a whisper. James's voice softened further. Maybe not, but neither am I. Charlotte exhaled. It came out like a laugh, but without any humor. You've known me less than 24 hours. He nodded. Sometimes, clarity comes quicker than time allows. She turned away, pacing the length of the room. Every nerve in her body screamed to leave, to pack up and run like she always did when things became too real. But another voice, a smaller one, asked, what if the offer wasn't just madness, but mercy? What if, for once, someone saw her not as a woman to fix or rescue, but to choose? Let me think about it, she said finally. James smiled. Not a grin, not victory, just a quiet curve of understanding. Of course. As she left the suite, the words replayed in her mind. I want you to carry my child. And underneath the absurdity, Charlotte felt the ground shift, not because he had asked, but because she hadn't said no. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. Back in the rental studio apartment she'd booked months ago just in case Lindmark accepted her pitch, she sat curled on the edge of the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Outside, the snowstorm had eased into soft, drifting silence. Chicago was still cloaked in white, but inside, her thoughts were anything but still. The heat clicked faintly from the radiator. A single lamp glowed beside her suitcase, which sat untouched since her return from the hotel. His words echoed in the quiet. I want a child, and I want you to carry it. No promises, no love. Just logistics dressed up in courtesy. James Whitaker hadn't even flinched when he said it, and she hadn't laughed, or screamed, or walked out. She'd said, let me think about it. Charlotte pressed her forehead against her knees, her breath shaky. She'd survived hard choices before, dropping out of her master's program to care for her mother after the stroke, leaving her marriage when it became a silent war instead of a home, building her agency from a hand-me-down laptop and sleepless nights. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about what part of herself she was willing to trade to keep surviving. Her phone buzzed beside her, one new message from her mother. Weather looks bad out there. Did the meeting go well? I believe in you, sweetheart. Always. Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. The next morning, the coffee at the airport was bitter and watery, but it kept her hands warm. Her flight to Seattle had finally been rescheduled. She watched people rush by in layers of coats and weary eyes. On the plane, she stared out the window, not seeing much beyond the frosted clouds. $5 million. It would erase the debts. She could rehire her team, expand, pay back everyone who believed in her, build something real, lasting. And yet, the thought of signing a contract to become someone's incubator made her stomach knot. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine at doctor's offices, prenatal visits, Paparazzi maybe, once the press found out. A child who would grow up knowing their parents began as a negotiation. Would that child feel wanted? Would she Seattle greeted her with gray skies and drizzle? The studio office was cold when she unlocked it, the heater always needing an hour to catch up. Boxes of mock-ups and mood boards lined the back wall. Her assistant's desk was empty. Marie had been let go 2 weeks ago. Still, she sat at her desk and opened the budget spreadsheet again. The red numbers stared back, colder than any snow. 3 weeks, maybe 4. And that was being generous. She rubbed her temples, the weight of it all settling onto her chest like wet concrete. Later that evening, Charlotte visited her mother. The small house in Spokane was humble but warm, always smelling faintly of rosemary and lemon cleaner. Her mother, Sarah, opened the door with a knitted shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a book tucked under one arm. "Well, you didn't die in Chicago," she said with a smile. "Not for lack of trying," Charlotte muttered as she stepped inside. Sarah watched her daughter carefully. "You didn't get the contract." Charlotte shook her head. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." They sat in the kitchen, tea steamed in mismatched mugs. After a long silence, Charlotte said, "Mom, if someone offered to fix everything to fund the business, wipe out debt, but they asked for something personal in return, would you do it?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She stirred her tea, the spoon clicking gently against porcelain. "I suppose it depends on what they were asking for. A child." That brought her mother's eyes up. Charlotte kept her voice steady. "Someone I met, James Whitaker. He's sick. He wants an heir. He offered to invest in Prism Studio if I agree to carry his child. No romantic involvement, just a business arrangement." Sarah stared at her for a long time. The silence between them thickened until Charlotte almost regretted saying anything at all. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Do you remember when I sold your father's motorcycle after he left?" Charlotte frowned. "You loved that thing." "I needed the money for your braces. I hated every second of that decision. But it wasn't about me. It was about what kind of future I wanted for you." "That's different." "Is it?" her mother asked quietly. "You're not selling your body. You're being asked to give life. The question is, would you be doing it for the child's sake or for your own survival?" Charlotte bit her lip. "Maybe both." Sarah reached across the table and held her daughter's hand. "Whatever decision you make sure you can look in the mirror after and that you won't resent that child, even for a moment." Charlotte nodded, her throat thick. Later that night, alone again in her apartment, she scrolled through the pages of her proposal, through years of notes, sketches, early drafts, all the late nights, all the no's, all the almosts. The next morning, her phone chimed. "I'll be in Seattle tomorrow. If you want to talk, Jay." She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed, "Let's meet," not because she'd decided, but because she knew she couldn't keep pretending she hadn't already started to. The sky over Seattle was a moody canvas of grays and pale blues when Charlotte stepped into the lobby of the Four Seasons. Her reflection flickered faintly on the marble floors, high boots damp from the sidewalk slush, trench coat pulled snug, hair tucked behind her ears in a style that meant business. James was already waiting in the private dining room off the mezzanine. No assistant, no entourage, just him, seated at a small table set for two. Sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows casting long shadows across crisp white linens. He stood when she entered, a small, quiet courtesy. Charlotte noticed, despite herself. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He returned. "You came." She slid into the chair opposite him. "I haven't said yes." "I know." A server appeared, and James ordered for both of them poached eggs, avocado toast, fresh berries, black coffee. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "I asked your assistant once, back when you were pitching to Lindmark." He explained almost sheepishly. "She mentioned your go-to breakfast when you're under pressure." Charlotte huffed a quiet laugh. "That's unsettlingly thorough. I don't believe in wasted conversations." They ate in near silence. The food was excellent, but Charlotte barely tasted it. Her mind was already racing ahead, to the papers she knew were sitting in the leather folder beside him. The weight of a decision not yet made sat heavy on her chest. After the plates were cleared, James pushed the folder across the table. This is what it would look like, legally, logistically. Charlotte stared at it, cream-colored, thick, unassuming, like it didn't carry the weight of a life inside. She opened it slowly. 10 pages, neatly formatted, clean language, no buried tricks, no deceit. The undersigned agrees to participate in a mutually consensual arrangement. Charlotte skimmed the major sections: medical coverage, genetic testing, investment details, custody terms, educational stipends, health insurance for the child until age 25, a clause about privacy, another about termination, should either party withdraw before insemination, no clause about affection, no mention of what would happen if they felt something. James watched her, but not with urgency, more like someone observing a tide roll and letting it arrive when it's ready. "This is thorough," she said finally. "I wanted you to feel protected. There's no emotion in this. There's no emotion in a contract." James replied softly, "Just accountability." Charlotte looked up at him. "And if this doesn't stay unemotional," he didn't blink, "then we talk about it, as two adults who started something together and who want to do right by whatever comes of it." There was a long silence. Finally, Charlotte closed the folder. "I want my lawyer to look it over." "Of course." She hesitated. Then, with a dry smile, "This is the weirdest business meeting I've ever had." James's expression lifted just slightly. "Mine too." He stood, walking toward the window, hands in his pockets. "When I was a kid, my mother used to make up constellations. We'd lie on the roof and she'd point to the sky, naming stars like they were old friends." Charlotte tilted her head. "This wasn't in the contract," she'd say. "You don't get to choose when the stars appear, but you do get to name them." He turned to face her. "I've made peace with not having love the way most people do, but I still believe in legacy, in naming something that matters." Charlotte looked at him a long time. "You think this child would be enough?" James's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but it would mean I didn't leave this world empty." That hit her harder than she expected, because somewhere deep inside, under the grit and the stubbornness, she knew that feeling, knew what it was to build and fight and still feel like it might all disappear without a trace. That night, Charlotte sat by her apartment window, the contract folder resting on her lap like a sleeping animal. Outside, the city buzzed softly, headlights skipping along wet streets, neon signs flickering in the distance. But in her little world, everything had narrowed to a single question. Can you choose to create a life without love? She imagined a child running barefoot through morning light, a giggle, a small hand reaching for hers. And she imagined James, not as the tech mogul, but the man who told stories about constellations. The man who said, "You didn't shatter. Could it be just a transaction? Could it become more?" She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time, she felt herself leaning forward just slightly into the unknown. Charlotte didn't sign the contract right away. Instead, she moved into the guest house behind James's Lake Union property for what they agreed would be a 30-day consideration period. A strange, sterile name for a very human waiting game. The property was quiet, perched just above the water. The house itself was modern, but not ostentatious clean lines, wood and stone, floor-to-ceiling glass that invited the lake into every room. The guest house was equally tasteful, minimalist, comfortable, but lonely. Charlotte unpacked her things into empty drawers, breathing in that faint new wood scent that reminded her of freshly sanded furniture in her father's workshop when she was a child, familiar, isolated. She didn't see James for the first 2 days. He left a note on the counter in his neat, slanted handwriting. "There's fresh fruit in the fridge. Take the kayak if you like. I'll be working from the main house all week, Jay. No pressure, no hovering, just space." But Charlotte noticed. She noticed the folded blanket on the couch, too neatly draped to have been used. The bowl of lemons in the kitchen replaced the second they showed any sign of softness. The silence that filled the house at night like it had grown used to being alone. On the third evening, she found herself walking the gravel path to the main house. She knocked once, unsure if she even wanted him to answer. He did. He looked tired, not exhausted, just worn at the edges, like a man who had carried his own silence too long. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. They ate on the back deck grilled salmon, roasted carrots, a chilled white wine he never touched. Conversation was minimal, but Charlotte watched the way his hands moved, careful, deliberate. She noticed he washed his own dishes, even though he had staff, that he stacked his books with the spines lined perfectly on the shelves, that he listened when she spoke, not waiting to reply, but simply to understand. By the end of the week, they had developed a rhythm. Charlotte took her morning coffee by the dock. James worked in his office, a large glass-walled room facing the water, filled with sketches and whiteboards and open windows. Some evenings, they sat quietly and listened to old jazz records. They never talked about the contract, but everything they didn't say was starting to say too much. One rainy afternoon, Charlotte stood barefoot in the kitchen, stirring soup. The rain tapped gently on the windows, like a rhythm only she and the weather knew. She heard his footsteps before he appeared, soft but distinct. James leaned on the doorway, arms crossed. "I didn't know you cook. I didn't know you collected Coltrane records." He gave a quiet smile. "We're both full of surprises." There was something in his eyes, not flirtation, not expectation, but recognition. That look two people share when they realize they're no longer strangers. "Do you want to try it?" she asked, lifting the ladle. He stepped forward and took the spoon from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. Just a second longer than necessary. Their eyes met. Still, no words. Still, too many. That night, Charlotte sat at the piano in the guest house. She hadn't played in years, but her fingers remembered. The muscle memory of grief and longing, and every note she never spoke aloud. She played softly, something unfinished, something hers. James listened from the hallway. He didn't come in. He didn't clap. But when she stopped, she heard him say, "Don't stop playing on my account." One evening, a power outage cut through the neighborhood. The storm had knocked out transformers up the hill. The lake shimmered in darkness. James brought over candles and a bottle of bourbon. They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, the warm glow dancing across their faces. "Were you ever in love?" Charlotte asked, without thinking. James stared into the flame. "Once, a long time ago, we wanted different things. She wanted a simple life. I wanted to build something larger. Do you ever regret that?" "Sometimes," he said, "but mostly, I regret how little I said out loud." Charlotte wrapped her arms around her knees. Silence protects until it doesn't. James looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Do you think you'll say yes?" She didn't answer, but her eyes softened, and that was enough. The next morning, she walked into his office and placed the contract on his desk, signed. James looked up slowly. "No questions?" he asked. "I've asked them all, just not always out loud." He closed the folder carefully, and for the first time, he let the silence fall like a gentle exhale, not tense, not expectant, just present. It started with a door left open. Charlotte had just finished her evening walk around the lake. The air was crisp, tinged with cedar and distant rain. The sun had dipped behind the trees, turning the water a deep navy blue, streaked with amber from the last light of day. When she returned to the guest house, she noticed the door to James's main home was ajar. She hesitated, then called out, "James." No answer. Something nudged at her. Not fear, just curiosity wrapped in concern. She stepped through the door. The house was quiet, dimly lit, music playing low from a speaker in the kitchen, Chet Baker, soft and melancholy. She followed the sound and found James sitting on the floor by the window, his back against the wall, a half-filled glass of bourbon resting on the floor beside him. He wasn't drunk, just far away in his thoughts. Charlotte crouched down a few feet from him. You okay? He looked up slowly, eyes glassy but clear. I'm fine, he said. Just thinking too hard. About... He hesitated. Then about how strange it is to feel this close to someone without knowing what to call it. Charlotte's breath caught. He didn't say it with longing or desperation. He said it like a confession. She sat beside him, knees to her chest, mimicking his posture. The silence between them stretched, not heavy, not awkward, just real. He spoke again, voice softer now. My mother passed away in this room. Charlotte turned to him. He was still staring out the window. She loved this house. He continued, said it felt alive to her, like it could hold memories better than people could. Charlotte whispered. What kind of memories? James glanced at her. Sunday mornings with jazz and orange slices, birthday candles at the kitchen table, arguments that ended with laughter. He smiled faintly. She used to say silence wasn't the absence of love, it was the proof of it. If two people could sit in it together. Charlotte looked down at her hands. I used to believe that too, she murmured. But silence can turn cruel when it lingers too long. He turned toward her. She didn't know if it was the warmth in the room, or the way his eyes softened, or the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. But then, without warning, without permission, something shifted. James reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. And for a moment, the world narrowed. No contract, no plan, no agreement. Just breath and skin and the kind of stillness that only exists in moments about to break. Charlotte didn't pull away, and he didn't ask. He kissed her, not with hunger, not with urgency, but with a tenderness so deliberate it felt like a vow. A kiss that asked nothing and promised nothing, yet said everything. When it ended, he pulled back slowly, his forehead resting lightly against hers. I'm sorry, he whispered. That wasn't part of the deal. Charlotte's eyes fluttered open. She searched his face. I know, she said, but I didn't hate it. He gave a small laugh, more breath than sound. She rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a while, the music playing softly, the bourbon forgotten. No more words, none needed. The next morning, Charlotte awoke to a note on her porch, written in the same careful handwriting. Last night wasn't a mistake, but I want you to know it doesn't change anything, unless you want it to. Jay. She stared at the note for a long time, her thumb brushing the corner. She didn't know how to feel. She hadn't expected this, but she didn't feel confused. She felt acknowledged, like someone had seen a part of her she didn't know she'd been hiding. Later that afternoon, James returned from the city. Charlotte was watering the rosemary by the window when she heard his car pull up. She didn't move. When he came inside, he paused in the entryway. They locked eyes. Hi, he said softly. Hi. A pause. Then, simply, do you want to walk? She nodded. They walked around the lake trail, the late autumn air brushing against their sleeves. Neither spoke much, but their hands brushed once, and then didn't part. When they returned, he made tea. She stayed for dinner. That night, they didn't kiss. They didn't need to, because something had changed, not loudly, but permanently. James didn't say where they were going. He simply showed up at the guest house on Friday morning with 2 travel mugs of coffee, a small smile, and an invitation. Pack a bag, comfortable clothes, warm layers. We'll be back Sunday night. Charlotte looked at him, skeptical. That's not vague at all. I like surprises, he said, handing her the coffee, and you could use a break from the spreadsheets. He wasn't wrong. Her head had been spinning for days, budgets, emails, doctor consultations, all laced with the strange new reality that she was about to carry a child for a man she might actually be falling for. Maybe a weekend away was exactly what she needed. They drove east for hours. The landscape shifted from wet urban sprawl to stretches of evergreen, winding mountain roads, then wide open sky. James's cabin on Flathead Lake sat hidden beyond a narrow gravel road lined with pine. It was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, crafted from aged timber and glass, with a porch that opened onto the water. A dock stretched out like a path to nowhere, and the trees cradled the house like a secret. "Did you build this?" Charlotte asked, stepping out of the car, pulling her coat tighter. "My father did." James replied, "When I was 9, we spent summers here. It's the only place I ever saw him laugh. The house was simple, no smart tech, no staff, just a stone fireplace, warm quilts, a well-worn kitchen. It was the kind of place where grief had softened into memory, and he was sharing it with her. That alone said more than any contract ever could." That night, they sat by the fire with soup and old records playing from a dusty player. Charlotte noticed the small details again, how James always handed her things with both hands, like she mattered, how he watched her when she wasn't looking, not with hunger, but with gentleness. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he said, his voice low over the crackle of the logs. Charlotte hesitated, then took a breath. "When I was 22, I thought I was pregnant. It turned out to be nothing, just stress and late nights. But for 3 days, I felt something I couldn't name. Fear, yes, but also wonder." She stared at the fire. "I didn't even want a child back then, but the idea that there might be a life inside me, it changed something." James didn't speak. He just reached across the couch and gently covered her hand with his. The next morning, they kayaked in silence across the lake, fog curling around them like breath. Charlotte had never felt so far from everything that once seemed urgent. Later, they chopped wood, cooked together, drank tea while watching the wind stir the treetops. The closeness wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. On Saturday evening, as the sun melted into the lake and everything turned amber and indigo, Charlotte stood barefoot on the dock, wrapped in a flannel blanket. James joined her, his hands in his jacket pockets. "You're different here," she said. "So are you." They stood in silence. Then she asked the question that had been sitting between them like a shadow. "Why me, James?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you're not afraid to be still. You don't fill silence with noise. You let it breathe." She turned to him, her voice soft. "You think that makes me mother material. I think that makes you real." He looked out over the water. "Everyone else in my life wants something. You never asked for anything, not even when I offered too much." Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. "You're wrong," she whispered. "I did want something." He looked at her sharply. "What?" She swallowed. "To be seen." James stepped closer. "And do you feel seen now?" She nodded. "Too much, sometimes." And then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he reached for her. This kiss was different from the first, less hesitant, more certain, a choice, not an accident. It tasted like trust, like home. They didn't sleep together that night. They lay side by side on the couch, watching the fire burn low, her head on his chest, his hand resting over hers. No need for more, not yet, because this was already everything neither of them had planned for. When Sunday came, they didn't want to leave, but Charlotte knew she had decisions to make, and soon her body might no longer be just hers. As they drove back, James glanced at her. "You okay?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "Yeah, just thinking about what she looked at him. That I've never wanted to say yes to something and be terrified of it at the same time." James didn't answer, but he reached over and took her hand, resting it gently on the console between them, and this time she held on. The medical center was tucked behind a quiet street in Bellevue, sterile and calm, with warm wood panels and lavender diffusers trying to mask the scent of antiseptic. Charlotte sat in the waiting room, flipping through a travel magazine without reading a word. Her fingers were cold, but her palms were sweating. She could feel James's presence beside her still, calm, hands resting on his lap like he had rehearsed peace. The nurse finally called her name, Charlotte Miller. She stood, smoothing her sweater. James touched her arm briefly. I'll wait here. She hesitated. You don't have to, I know, he said, but I want to. That made something flutter in her chest, something too soft, too early. She nodded, then followed the nurse down the hallway. The procedure was quick. Blood tests, hormonal evaluation, an ultrasound to check her uterine lining. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a practical tone, explained every step as if Charlotte were both a patient and a participant in something sacred. You're healthy, the doctor said as she handed her a robe for the final scan. Your body's in great condition for implantation. Charlotte gave a small smile. That's good. I think... You seem uncertain, the doctor said gently, tapping at her notes. Charlotte paused, then said, Is it normal to feel too many things at once? The doctor gave a kind smile. Yes, especially when your heart and body are being asked to walk the same tightrope. Charlotte lay back for the scan, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The ultrasound gel was cold. The screen lit up. A faint line curved across the monitor. Everything looks good, the doctor said. Once we confirm the embryo viability from Mr. Whitaker's sample, we'll schedule the transfer for next week. Charlotte closed her eyes. Next week. This wasn't a theory anymore. When she returned to the lobby, James stood as if he'd been waiting for hours. He searched her face. You okay? Charlotte gave a small nod. Everything's good. We're a go. James smiled slightly, relief barely veiled behind the tension in his jaw. Let's get out of here, he said. They spent the rest of the afternoon at Green Lake, walking slowly around the loop trail. Ducks glided silently across the water. Joggers passed them. Life went on, oblivious to the fact that hers was about to change forever. James finally spoke as they stopped under a tree, watching a golden retriever chase its own tail on the grass. I don't want this to feel like business, he said. Charlotte turned to him. It started as business. I know, he said, but not anymore. Not really. A silence. Then, softly, You don't owe me anything, Charlotte. Even if you change your mind? Charlotte looked at him, really looked, and what she saw wasn't just sincerity, but fear, quiet, well hidden, but real. I'm not going to change my mind, she said. I just need time to catch up with what my heart already knows. He nodded once, and for the first time, he reached for her hand, not as an agreement, but as a comfort. A week later, the embryo transfer was complete. It was clinical, quiet, no grand emotion, no dramatic music swelling, just a sterile room, a kind nurse, and a thin catheter carrying the future into place. James waited outside, pacing the corridor with silent footsteps. When Charlotte came out, pale but steady, he looked up. She gave a thumbs up. Now we wait, she said. He nodded. But there was something different in his eyes now. Not relief. Something else. 2 weeks later, the blood test confirmed it. She was pregnant. They sat in her apartment that night, eating Thai takeout from paper boxes, the contract now long buried under stacks of ultrasound brochures and prenatal vitamins. James didn't say anything for a while. Then, out of nowhere, he murmured, I wonder who they'll look like. Charlotte paused, chopsticks in midair. James looked at her, surprised. I thought Charlotte froze, then pulled out the envelope from her coat pocket. She had picked it up from the clinic that morning. She hadn't opened it, not yet. Do you want to know, she asked. James nodded, quiet. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She scanned it, then blinked, twice. Oh my God. James stood. What she looked at him, lips parting. It's twins. His expression didn't change for a heartbeat. Then he sat down slowly. Twins, he repeated. Charlotte nodded. 2 heartbeats. 2 embryos took. He exhaled, like someone who'd just had the air knocked out of him. She watched him carefully. Is that too much? He shook his head slowly, then laughed a low, surprised sound. No, not too much. Just more than I expected. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Charlotte stared down at the paper in her lap. 2 lives, not 1. And suddenly, the world felt both wider and smaller at once. James reached for her hand. No words this time, only a look, and the quiet, awe-filled understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. The news broke on a Monday. It started as a quiet ripple, just a rumor on a tech gossip blog, buried beneath headlines about funding rounds and IPOs. But by Tuesday, the ripple had become a wave. James Whittaker expecting child with unknown woman. Sources suggest secret surrogacy. Deal, is this the future of family billionaire's unconventional path to fatherhood? Charlotte stared at the headlines, heart thudding. Her face wasn't in any of the photos yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Emails with subject lines like urgent comment request and exclusive interview opportunity. By Wednesday, it was everywhere. And by Thursday, she was on the front page of 3 news apps. Someone had leaked her name. Someone always did. James called her first thing in the morning. His voice was taut, but calm. I'm so sorry. Charlotte. I swear I didn't say anything. I know, she said. But someone did. There was a pause on the line. I'm handling it, he said. My legal team's already filed takedown requests. They're working on a statement. Charlotte stared out the window. Do I have to make one too? Only if you want to, James said gently. But whatever happens, I'm standing with you. You're not alone in this. She believed him, but that didn't mean she wasn't scared. By Friday, there were paparazzi camped outside her apartment. Charlotte slipped out the back staircase wearing sunglasses and a hoodie, one hand cradling the beginnings of a curve in her belly. It wasn't visible to the world yet, but she could feel it, the weight of it, the reality. She drove to the lake house without calling first. She needed space, and James. He opened the door before she even knocked. His jaw tightened when he saw her expression. You saw them. She nodded, and they saw me. He stepped aside. She walked in. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with what they both knew they couldn't undo. They sat by the fireplace that night. No jazz this time, just the sound of rain against the glass and the hum of the storm growing outside. Do you regret this? Charlotte asked, her voice almost a whisper. James looked at her slowly. No, not for 1 second. But you're bored your investors. Don't get a say in who I become a father with. She looked away. I didn't want this to be public, she said. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I wanted it to be ours. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. We can still have that, Charlotte. They can take our privacy, but they can't define this, not unless we let them. She nodded slowly, then asked, do we go public? Tell them the truth about how this started and what it's become. James exhaled. If we do, it needs to be both of us, together. Not a press release, she added. He looked at her. No, a conversation. That Sunday. They sat in his study, laptops open, coffee between them. The baby's first ultrasound photo rested in a silver frame nearby 2 blurry little pulses of light, already rewriting everything. They drafted a statement together, but more than that, they filmed a video. It wasn't polished, no fancy lights, no spin, just James and Charlotte sitting side by side, telling the truth. This began as an agreement, a choice between 2 adults who wanted to bring life into the world. But things change. People change. What started as a contract has become something more. We're expecting twins, and we're not hiding. They uploaded it to James's company YouTube page, posted a link on his verified Twitter and LinkedIn profiles. Within an hour, it had over 1 million views. By the end of the day, it was on every major outlet. Public reaction was mixed. Some praised their honesty, some accused Charlotte of being a gold digger. Others called James irresponsible for romanticizing surrogacy. But the noise didn't rattle them as much as she feared it would, because in the center of it all, they had each other. Still, the fallout wasn't over. Monday morning. Charlotte received a call from Prism Studios' last investor. He pulled out of their agreement. "I can't risk the association right now," he said, not unkindly. "You understand?" She did. And yet, when she hung up, the tears still came, not because of the money, but because she had fought so long, so hard to be seen as more than a woman with a womb. James found her in the kitchen later that day. She didn't try to hide her red eyes. "They're pulling out," she said simply. He was quiet. Then we build something better." Charlotte shook her head. "You keep saying that, but I'm not sure I even remember how." James touched her face, his palm warm against her cheek. "I do," he said, "and I'll remind you, as many times as it takes." That night, they watched the sunset from the porch, Charlotte wrapped in a blanket, her head on his shoulder. The world kept asking, but for now, they had answered. Together. It began with a cramp, just a sharp, sudden twist in Charlotte's lower abdomen, like a knot pulled too tight. She paused mid-step in the hallway, one hand bracing against the wall, her breath catching. She'd felt odd all morning, a little dizzy, unusually tired, but she'd chalked it up to poor sleep and hormones. The twins had made her body feel like someone else's lately, and she'd accepted it, even laughed about it. But this wasn't normal. She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, one hand instinctively cradling her stomach. Then came the second cramp, sharper, deeper, stealing her breath. She didn't wait. She called James. They met at the clinic 20 minutes later. He'd broken every speed limit between the lake house and the city, but when he entered the exam room, he moved quietly, his calm like a shield over panic. Charlotte was already on the table, the nurse checking vitals, the doctor prepping the ultrasound. James reached for her hand without a word. She squeezed it, hard. The screen flickered to life. 2 shapes, 2 heartbeats. Still there, still strong. But the doctor's expression didn't ease. "There's a small separation in the placenta," she said gently. "A partial abruption. It's minor for now, but with twins, we have to be cautious." Charlotte stared at the ceiling. "Is it dangerous? It can be if it worsens. Right now, it's manageable. But I want you on modified bed rest for the next 4 weeks. No travel, no stress, and we'll monitor you weekly." James's grip on her hand tightened. "Can we lose them?" he asked, voice barely audible. The doctor hesitated just for a second. "If things stay stable, you have an excellent chance. But yes, if the abruption progresses, there's a risk." Silence filled the room like fog. They drove back to the lake house in silence. Charlotte stared out the window, one hand resting on her belly, the other clenched in her lap. James kept glancing sideways at her, but didn't push. Back home, she went straight to bed. Not because she was tired, but because if she stayed upright, she might unravel. That night, James sat beside her on the edge of the bed, rubbing her foot gently beneath the blanket. "Say something," she murmured. He exhaled. "I don't know what to say." She looked at him. "Tell me it's going to be okay." He swallowed. "It is. Even if I'm afraid, I'll believe it for both of us." Charlotte blinked hard. "I didn't know I could want something so much until it became a maybe." James nodded. "I know." She reached for his hand, and for the first time in days, she let herself cry, not for the past, not for the press, but for the 2 small lives inside her and the thin thread now holding them close. The next morning, James rearranged everything. He moved his office into the guest room. He scheduled the weekly OB visits to happen at the house with a private nurse. He cooked. He did laundry. He even read articles about twin pregnancies late into the night, then softly recited statistics to her when she couldn't sleep. And Charlotte, for once, let someone take care of her. She lay still. She drank water. She stopped answering work calls. But at night, when James was asleep on the couch across the room, she would rest her hand on her belly and whisper, Stay with me. One night, around 2 a.m., she woke to the sound of faint crying. James. He was in the kitchen, crouched by the cabinet, head resting against the counter, shoulders shaking. She stood in the doorway for a moment, silent, then walked over and knelt beside him. He looked up, startled, then ashamed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Charlotte shook her head. What's wrong? He hesitated. Then I didn't think I could lose again. She tilted her head. Again. He nodded slowly. My mother's first pregnancy ended at 20 weeks. She never talked about it much, but I remember the way she went quiet for years afterward. I remember how she'd pause sometimes, like listening for a voice that wasn't there. He met Charlotte's eyes. I think some part of me thought this would fix everything, that giving life would mean I could finally outrun what was taken. Charlotte placed her hand over his. We're not broken things looking to be repaired, James. He blinked. We're people, and love isn't earned through perfection. It's chosen in uncertainty. He didn't speak. He just pulled her close. And for the first time, she felt them breathe together in the grief they didn't choose, and the hope they couldn't let go. The next ultrasound, a week later, brought better news. No worsening, stable. Tiny heartbeats flickered across the screen like blinking stars. James let out a breath like he'd been holding it for days. Charlotte squeezed his hand, smiling through tears. They stayed, she whispered. They heard you, James said softly. And in that moment, it wasn't about contracts, or headlines, or loss. It was just about holding on. The rain had returned to Seattle, soft and steady, painting the lake in rippling circles that shimmered beneath the clouded sky. Charlotte lay on the couch in the reading nook by the window, a pillow tucked behind her back, a mug of ginger tea cooling on the end table. She was nearly 18 weeks along. The baby's 2 lives that had once been theoretical now moved in small flutters beneath her ribs. It was like being tapped lightly from the inside, like the wings of something barely awake. James sat across from her, reading quietly, not a tablet, not a report, but a paperback Winnie the Pooh, of all things. She laughed when she saw it. You're getting ahead of yourself. He looked up over the top of the book. I'm just doing my research. Pooh had some underrated wisdom. Charlotte tilted her head, like what he read aloud. Sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. Their eyes met, and neither of them smiled. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it was. Later that day, James suggested they take the boat out just around the dock. Nothing risky. Charlotte hesitated at first, but the sun had peeked through for the first time in days, and something in her ached to feel wind again. He helped her into the small electric launch, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. She sat near the bow, hand resting on the curve of her belly, while he steered them slowly into the open. The lake was quiet, only the soft hum of the boat and the distant call of loons. Charlotte breathed deeply. I used to think I'd raise kids in a city. I imagined walking them to school, morning rush, coffee shops, noise. James glanced over, and now she looked around, at the trees, the water, the sky. I could get used to quiet. A pause, then she added, with the right people. His knuckles tightened slightly on the wheel. That evening, while folding laundry, Charlotte found a piece of paper tucked inside one of James's flannel shirts, a torn corner of notebook paper, creased and faded. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a few lines of handwriting in blue ink. I don't know how to love gently. I only know how to stay, even when it gets quiet, especially then. She held it for a long time, then slipped it into her journal. That night, the power flickered out in the middle of dinner. No storm, no warning, just sudden darkness, followed by silence. James lit the fireplace and pulled out candles. Charlotte watched him move with the ease of someone who had lived in interruption before. They sat on the rug, sharing warm bread and soup from enamel bowls. When they finished, he poured 2 small glasses of apple cider and handed her one, to what she asked. He considered, then said softly, to showing up, even when it's inconvenient. She touched her glass to his. They drank. Later, curled beneath the thick quilt on the couch. Charlotte turned to him. James. He looked up. Do you think this, whatever this is, will last when the babies come? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand gently on her stomach, feeling the faintest movement beneath her skin. I think love looks different for different people, he said. Some people fall fast, some grow slow, but I don't think it disappears just because life gets harder. She nodded. I think I'm afraid of becoming someone else, of disappearing into motherhood, into you. He met her gaze. Then I'll spend the rest of my life reminding you of who you are. She felt her throat tighten. He continued. I don't love you because you're carrying my children, Charlotte. I love you because even when everything went sideways, you never stopped being you. There it was. The word, finally spoken. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She let it land, soft and sure, like it had always been waiting. And then, in the quiet, she replied, I love you too. They didn't kiss, not right away. They just sat, foreheads touching, wrapped in warmth, while the babies stirred gently between them. And somewhere in that moment, between silence and light, they both knew this wasn't about a contract anymore. It was about staying. From the story, you're carrying my heir. Then the millionaire found out. It was twins, and proposed through tears. Charlotte was in the greenhouse when the car arrived. It was a long black sedan, sleek and out of place against the gravel drive and pine-scented breeze of the lake estate. She saw it through the glass as she tended to her lemon balm, the reflection distorting its arrival like a warning. James was already walking down the steps of the main house when the back door opened. From the car stepped a man tall, commanding, with silver hair and a navy overcoat buttoned to his throat. He didn't look around. He looked directly at James. Charlotte couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the temperature of the moment change. When she entered the house 15 minutes later, James was in the living room, standing stiffly near the fireplace, his jaw tight. He didn't look at her right away. That was my father, he said flatly. Charlotte froze. You've never mentioned him. There's a reason. He walked toward the window, arms crossed. He's a venture capitalist. Old money, legacy power. Thinks emotions are for people who don't have empires to run. She approached slowly. Why was he here? James turned, meeting her gaze with something unreadable. He found out about the babies, about you. Charlotte's stomach tightened. What did he want? James hesitated, then said, to make you go away. He handed her an envelope. Inside, a check. $1 million. Made out in Charlotte's name. She stared at it, then at him. Is this a joke? James shook his head. He thinks I'm distracted, that I'm trading legacy for sentiment, that love is weakness. And you said, I told him to leave. That I don't need his money, or his approval. Charlotte sat down slowly. He wants to buy me out of your life. James crouched in front of her, and he doesn't understand that there's no price for what we have. But Charlotte was quiet, because for the first time since their relationship had shifted from arrangement to something real, she wasn't sure if she still belonged. That night, she lay awake long after James had fallen asleep. The check still sat on the dresser. She hadn't torn it up, not yet, because part of her, the old part, the survivor part, whispered, you don't get to stay in places like this, not forever. James's world was carved in stone and legacy. She was soil and hands and quiet things. Maybe his father was just the mirror, the part of the world that reminded her where she didn't fit. The next morning, she stood by the lake, watching the sun rise over the trees. James came to stand beside her. You're thinking about leaving, he said quietly. Charlotte didn't answer. He continued. You think this house, this life, this future, it was never meant for you. She turned to him. Maybe I don't want to be someone you have to defend. You're not... His voice was steady. You're someone I choose, and I'll keep choosing you, whether the world applauds or turns its back. A long silence passed. Then he said, almost a whisper, "You don't owe him your silence, Charlotte, or your disappearance, and you don't owe me your staying, either. But if you're looking for permission to belong, you already do." Charlotte felt her throat catch. "I'm scared." He nodded. "So am I." And somehow, that made it better. That afternoon, a package arrived. No note. Just a small wooden box. Inside, a photograph. James as a child, no older than 6, sitting in a boat beside a young woman who could only be his mother. Laughing, free. Tucked behind the frame, a second check torn cleanly in half. Charlotte stared at it, then at James. He smiled faintly. My mother's handwriting was on the back of that photo. I think he remembered, or maybe, for once, he just listened. She walked over and wrapped her arms around him, not because she wasn't still afraid, but because she finally believed he was afraid, too, and loving her anyway. That night, they lit a fire on the shore, wrapped in blankets, feet bare in the cold sand. Charlotte rested her head on James's shoulder, her hands curled around the curve of her belly. "I didn't tear the check," she said. James looked at her. "I noticed. I wanted to remember what it looks like when the world tries to buy you out of something sacred." He kissed her temple. "I'll never put a price on you, on them, on us." She smiled, and in that small space between heat and silence, fear and faith, she whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." It started with a strange pressure in Charlotte's lower back. At first, she thought it was just the usual late pregnancy discomfort. She was 34 weeks now, and everything was harder breathing, walking, sleeping. But this was different. The ache deepened as she tried to turn in bed, a low, constant burn that curled into her like a warning. By the time she woke James, her breathing had shortened. "It's probably Braxton Hicks," she said, forcing a smile through the tightening in her abdomen. But James was already putting on shoes, grabbing the go-bag they'd prepared, but hoped not to need just yet. "I'm calling the hospital," he said. "We're not risking this." The drive was quiet. Rain tapped against the windshield, soft and steady like a ticking clock. Charlotte sat with one hand gripping the armrest, the other pressed to her belly. The babies weren't kicking. They were still. Not silent, but still. James kept glancing sideways at her, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between the road and the rising fear on her face. When they arrived at the hospital, the lights overhead felt too bright, the walls too clean. A nurse met them at the door, wheeling Charlotte into triage while James jogged behind, already dialing her doctor. It was 2:12. Mum. An hour later, the ultrasound confirmed it early labor. Charlotte was dilating slowly, but progressing, and one of the twins had shifted position, causing mild fetal distress. "We may need to deliver," the doctor said. "Not tonight, but soon." Charlotte's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket over her swollen belly. She wasn't ready. Not like this. Not under fluorescent lights and IV drips and the dull hum of machines. James stood by her bedside, pale and silent, like someone holding his breath underwater. "I don't want them to come yet," she whispered. He knelt beside her, pressing her hand between both of his. "Then we hold on. Just a little longer." But he wasn't sure they had time. Outside, in the hallway. He called his mother's old obstetrician friend in Montana, then his legal advisor, then he just stopped. He leaned against the wall outside the maternity wing, the hospital quiet except for the hum of vending machines and a lullaby playing somewhere far off, a sound that made him ache. He realized something in that moment. There was no perfect time. There never had been. And everything that mattered was behind that door, right now. When he walked back into the room, Charlotte looked up at him with tired eyes. The monitor beeped softly behind her. A line marked her contractions. Another marked each twin's heartbeat. "Any updates?" she asked. He didn't speak. He walked to the side of the bed and knelt. "What are you doing?" she said, eyes narrowing slightly. James reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small velvet box. Charlotte froze. "No." She whispered. Not now. Not like this. He opened the box anyway. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a single diamond set low, quiet like her. Yes. Now, James said, because we've already built everything that matters. This ring isn't a promise of forever. It's a promise that whatever happens tonight, tomorrow, or years from now, I will not leave your side. Tears filled her eyes. You don't have to do this because you're scared. I'm doing it because I'm sure. She covered her mouth with her hands. This is the worst timing, she whispered through tears. James smiled. It's the only timing we've got. He reached for her hand. Charlotte Miller, will you marry me, before we become outnumbered by tiny humans with our stubbornness? A laugh broke through her tears, then a sob, and finally, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time that night, something in her exhaled. They didn't kiss. Not yet. Because just then, a nurse rushed in. We need to monitor twin A more closely, she said. We might be moving faster than expected. Charlotte's eyes widened. How fast? The nurse looked at James. You might be meeting your children by morning. Hours blurred. Doctors came and went. The world became contractions and monitors and murmurs outside the door. But in the center of it all, Charlotte and James stayed steady, not without fear, but with the kind of courage you only learn when the person beside you says, I'm not leaving. At 6:43 a.m. The sky outside the hospital turned gold behind the clouds. At 6:57 a.m. Twin A let out their first cry, sharp and defiant. At 6:59 a.m. Twin B followed, quieter, slower, but strong. 2 babies, 2 heartbeats, 2 reasons everything had been worth it. James held Charlotte's hand through it all, tears streaking his cheeks without shame. When it was done, when the chaos stilled and the cries settled into breathing, he leaned down, forehead against hers, and whispered, They're here, and you're incredible. Charlotte, pale but radiant, smiled. Now we're officially outnumbered. 6 weeks after the twins were born, the lake was frozen at the edges. The nursery smelled faintly of lavender and warm cotton. In the rocking chair by the window, Charlotte held Emma in her left arm and Noah in her right. Both babies were asleep, their breath soft against her chest. The house was quiet, not silent, but peaceful, like something had finally settled. James stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a bottle in one hand and a burp cloth tossed over his shoulder. His hair was a mess, his shirt slightly stained with formula. He smiled. You look like a goddess. Charlotte laughed softly. I look like I haven't showered in 2 days. Still counts. He walked over and knelt beside the chair, watching their children sleep. His voice lowered. Do you ever think about how close we came to missing this? She nodded. All the time. Then, after a pause, but we didn't. They named the babies together on the second night at the hospital. It was 3 a.m. The lights dimmed, and Charlotte was feeding Noah while James held Emma skin to skin against his chest. Charlotte spoke first. I always liked the name Emma. James looked down at the small, blinking girl curled against him. She looks like an Emma. And Noah. James grinned, strong and gentle, like his mom. Charlotte smiled, too tired to argue, and so it was decided. Emma Grace Whitaker, Noah Elias Whitaker. 2 names, 2 beginnings. In the days that followed, life didn't slow down. It changed. Diaper changes at 2 a.m. Late night walks around the kitchen to soothe the crying. Breastfeeding schedules, bottles, swaddles. Naps that lasted exactly 12 minutes. But in between the exhaustion were moments that caught her off guard. Moments that made her heart swell with something that had no name, except this. James humming lullabies. Noah gripping Charlotte's finger tightly in sleep. Emma's first half smile in the morning light. One afternoon, James surprised her. He'd spent days sneaking off between feedings, claiming to run errands. But when Charlotte stepped outside, bundled in her robe and holding Emma to her chest, she saw it. A garden, new soil, raised beds, a small greenhouse like the one she had left behind in Seattle. James stood beside it, holding a trowel, mud on his jeans. You always said you feel most like yourself with your hands in the dirt. Charlotte didn't say anything. She just walked over, pressed Emma gently into his arms, and kissed him. That night, after the babies had gone down, Charlotte took out a letter she had written to herself when she first moved into the guest house almost a year ago. She had sealed it in a brown envelope and tucked it into her journal, a letter she never intended to open unless something had truly changed. She read it slowly now, sitting by the fireplace. Dear me, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. It means you let someone see the softest parts of you and didn't run when it got real. It means you carried more than just a child. You carried the weight of your own fear and still chose love. I'm proud of you. And I hope you're proud of the life you're building, not the perfect one, but the one that finally feels like home. Charlotte folded the letter and held it to her chest. James walked in behind her, placed a blanket around her shoulders, and kissed the top of her head. You okay? She looked up. Yeah, I think I am. On a snowy March morning, they were married in the backyard, beneath the old willow tree by the lake. Just close friends. No press, no fanfare. Charlotte wore a simple ivory dress with sleeves. James wore a gray wool suit and a tie Emma had spit up on earlier that day. They exchanged vows written on torn pages from their shared journal. James's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. I loved you before I understood what love was, before I had the right words. I loved you in the pauses, in the fear, and in every breath that asked, will she stay? Charlotte smiled through tears. I stayed, she said, and I choose to stay. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. They kissed as the wind shook the trees, and somewhere nearby, the babies stirred their cries soft, insistent, alive. Later that night, they danced in the kitchen, just the two of them, barefoot and laughing, while bottles warmed in the background. Charlotte laid her head against James's shoulder. This is not how I thought my life would look, she murmured. James kissed her hair. Me neither. And then, after a long silence, he said, but maybe it's exactly what we were meant to become. Sometimes, life takes a detour not to punish us, but to lead us home. This story reminds us that love doesn't always arrive wrapped in romance or certainty. It may begin with misunderstanding, fear, or even a signed contract. But what matters is how we choose to show up, not just once, but again and again, especially when things get hard. For those of us who have lived long enough to know that life rarely unfolds the way we imagined, this is a gentle reminder. It's never too late to begin again, to open your heart, even if it's been bruised, to allow someone in, even when you've built walls to keep pain out. James and Charlotte's journey teaches us that healing often happens in the ordinary, in late-night bottles, quiet forgiveness, and the courage to stay when running feels safer, whether you're in your 50s, 60s, or beyond. Their story whispers something we all need to hear. You're not too old for new beginnings. You're not too late for love. And you're never too far from home if someone's still waiting for you. And sometimes, that someone might even be you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.